What can a silver medal
And a sweepstakes ticket?
teach us about interwar Ireland
Stick around and find out.
on Artifactually Speaking?
Hello and welcome to Artifactually Speaking. I'm Brad Hafford, archaeologist and specialist in the ancient world.
And I'm Tom Pedrick, historian of modern Europe.
And once again, we are bringing two artifacts from fairly recent history. As an archaeologist, I deal with ancient artifacts all the time, and we are applying archaeological principles in many ways to these objects. In other words, start with the object, find out what it can tell us, and then that will lead us to bigger questions about the time period and the people of that time period that these objects represent. And in this case, we've got two objects that relate to a very interesting and very complex history, the history of Ireland. Now, I've been to Ireland a couple of times, and it's a fabulous place to visit, and I have some friends in Ireland, and they've always told me that the history of Ireland is very complicated.
Yes, and that's part of the reason why Ireland's on my travel agenda. It's a complicated history, and we so frequently, its history is ignored in schools.
Exactly. I had never really thought much about it, but these objects really did give me a chance to, a kind of focal point, a place to look into the history and put them in, understand where these fit into history, even though they're minor objects. The background in which they were created and used is part of that history. And so then you can build up from the smaller to the bigger, rather than reading a book just about the history of Ireland and trying to learn the dates and the people involved. I don't know, it was a different approach to me, and it helped a lot. And I think that's why we're doing this series, to try to look at the objects.
Absolutely. We can actually almost touch the history itself.
Right. We are, in many ways, acting like journalists. We are asking questions of the objects that help us to focus and understand them more closely. And those questions are pretty much what journalists would ask, but we change the order a little. Journalists start with who, we start with what. Some of them seem simple, but all of them have multiple answers, really. It's what is it, what does it mean, where was it used, where was it found? And they get more complicated. The whys and the whos are pretty complex. But that's what makes it so interesting. So our first object, I believe you're going to tell us about, right, Tom?
Our first object for our one, it's a silver medal issued for volunteer service in World War I from the Kingdom of Mourne. The Kingdom of Mourne is the southern portion of County Down, modern Northern Ireland. This would have been issued in 1921 for service anywhere within the war years of 1914 to 1918. It was paid for by the Countess of Kilmorey in Kilkeel. That's the primary city in this region.
Right, I think most people won't have heard of Mourne. I certainly hadn't. And
Neither had I. It brushes up against the Mourne Mountains, which is probably where it gets its name from.
Mhm.
There were about 200 of them issued in total, 30 or so posthumously, and some were actually awarded to women as well.
Yeah, I think the Countess herself, being so fundamental in creating this medal, was interested in not just honoring the people who fought there, but the people who helped the war effort in general, including women, I think she said, who were in the war zone. Not sure exactly how many of them were issued to women, but certainly some of them were.
Right. And that's an example of how one object has already led us down another possible avenue of exploration that unfortunately we don't have a lot of time for, because we're getting to the issue of home rule in Ireland, and I'm going to try to summarize it briefly.
Right. This is part of that super complexity, right?
Right. Right.
World War I itself is complex, but we're talking about the very end of it, where these medals were issued locally to these people, and yet Ireland's already entering into a stage of even more complexity after the war.
Exactly. So home rule was the dominant political issue of Victorian Britain from roughly 1870 until World War I. Home rule was a push for internal autonomy within the United Kingdom. It's sometimes compared to how Canada existed within the British Empire. Part of the trouble all begins with the settlement in Ulster up in the north in the early 1600s by Anglo-Protestants. They and their descendants would concentrate there. They had much more loyalty and culture in common with the imperial home in England.
Right.
They were Protestant. A lot of the other denizens of the island were, of course, Catholic.
Right. Well, let's look at a map of the major areas of Ireland, and what you're talking about now is that northern portion called Ulster. Part of that becomes what we think of now in the modern world as Northern Ireland, but not all of Ulster, right?
Exactly, yeah. The border now winds and wraps around a little bit more, but broadly speaking, that's the origin of it.
Right. I think 6 counties up there become Northern Ireland.
Right. And of course, one of which is County Down.
Right.
So home rule is this dominant movement for decades. There were several home rule bills. There were 2 defeated in Parliament. One finally gets passed in 1912. There's a veto, but if they waited 2 years, the veto was overridden. But what happens in 1914?
The First World War, right.
Absolutely.
And that adds that element of complexity here when Ireland's already fighting for home rule, and now suddenly this issue worldwide kind of comes up. They have to fight the Germans. And in my head, I get this picture of Ireland kind of knocking on England's door and saying, can we rule ourselves? And they go, no.
Right.
And then they ask again, and they're like, no.
No.
And then they ask again, and finally they say, well, okay, but we have to go fight Germany first.
And it's perhaps a bit fortuitous that happened, because in Mourne, and especially all throughout Ulster, there were different factions arming and mobilizing. There were the Ulster Volunteers, who were against home rule. They were those Anglo-Protestants we were talking about.
Right.
And then there were the Irish Volunteers, who mobilized at a very similar time.
Yeah, this was something that I found somewhat unusual. When you hear the idea, home rule, it sounds like a no-brainer. Of course, you want to rule yourselves, right? Why would you fight against it? And yet the Ulster Volunteers are formed even to use force to try to stop home rule.
Absolutely. And the important question here is, of course, why?
Yeah.
Well, those Anglo-Protestants were a bit of a minority within Ireland. So with home rule, they feared they would be disenfranchised and lose out in a power struggle.
Right. So that was why they didn't necessarily want a parliament in Dublin, because then the majority Catholics might not pay as much attention to the minority Protestants, right?
Absolutely. So with the outbreak of war in 1914, that put the brakes on a escalating situation. The issue of home rule was suspended in the aptly named Suspensory Act of 1914.
Mm-hmm.
The Irish do go off to war, but among those who didn't, they saw an opportunity. So in 1916, a group of Republicans seized control of certain buildings in central Dublin and declared an Irish Republic.
Mm-hmm.
The British put it down with a tremendous force, executed the 7 men in charge of it, used a lot of artillery, a lot of nasty fighting, and that catalyzed Irish independence further. So now the issue was no longer home rule, it was independence. The words have become immortal through W.B. Yeats, who wrote Easter 1916. He said that after that catalyzing event, Ireland was changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born.
Yeah, it's an interesting phrase, isn't it? And Ireland is beautiful, but I guess they went through some pretty terrible times. So.
Absolutely. And I think it's no coincidence that in 1918 there was a major landslide victory in a parliamentary election. There was a new political party that came in and took about 70 seats. They call themselves Sinn Féin, or We Ourselves. They also declared a republic, the same one that had been fought for in 1916.
Mm-hmm.
And this, of course, led to the Irish War of Independence against Britain.
And that lasted about 3 years, didn't it?
Yeah, about until 1921, where there's a very important treaty signed, creating something called the Irish Free State.
Exactly. And that will take us up to our second artifact. This is an Irish Free State hospital sweepstake ticket. Well, there's a number of things we have to talk about there, but the first will be that term Free State. This particular ticket dates to 1936, and this is the period of the Free State, but that Free State begins, as you said, in 1922, because at the very end of 1921, the Anglo-Irish Treaty is first signed, and then it's taken back to the Assembly in Ireland. They do pass it by a small margin because it's a treaty that says the king is still nominally head. So Ireland is not completely independent. Instead, it is a free state, a dominion of the British Empire. And this leads the Irish to fight amongst themselves because there are a lot of Irish that say, no, that's not good enough. We need to be completely independent. The king has nothing to do with us. And we will fight to preserve that. But Ireland's just not in good shape at this point. It's a relatively poor country and things are not funded very well, including the hospitals. So they need money, and this whole sweepstakes idea is partly to fund the hospitals. Obviously, it's called the hospital sweepstakes, right? But there's a bigger history to that that is also complicated. We can go back to the time period you were talking about because there's the founder of this. His name's Richard Duggan. Well, he had known some people, he had some friends that died on board a ship that was sunk by a German U-boat. And the families of those people are struggling, and Duggan knows them, and he decides to make a fairly local sweepstakes to try to build up some money for these people. And it's very successful. So in 1922, he does another one that's fairly local. It's for a hospital. That works well too. By 1930, he's turned this into something very big. He's connected up with two other people, Captain Freeman, a Welsh publicist, and Joe McGrath, who was a politician. He had been an associate of Michael Collins, who was the one who negotiated the treaty, the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And we should probably talk a lot more about Michael Collins, but it will make this all too long, but he was a very important figure.
And he got himself into some hot water signing that treaty, didn't he?
He did. I think he mentioned that by signing it, he may have signed his own death warrant. And essentially he did, because he was killed not long after in an ambush. But by 1930, the sweepstakes becomes pretty big. What happens is you would buy a ticket for 10 shillings, and then all of those tickets are put into a barrel, and they would draw out one of them, and they would assign it to a horse in a race, that race often being run in England. And then they would draw another one for another horse, so each horse would get a ticket, and if the horse won, that ticket also won in the sweepstakes. Now, when you sell a whole lot of 10-shilling tickets, you could actually make a lot of money. In the second run, I've got some numbers from that, they sold around 3 million of these 10-shilling tickets. So that's £1.5 million. It's a lot of money. You could win a lot of money too. Let's look briefly at the back of the ticket. Very fine print here, but it shows that the winning horse would win £30,000 for the ticket holder. In 1936, that's a heck of a lot of money. And remember, this is also the Great Depression era. So everyone's struggling, and the opportunity to potentially get a heck of a lot of money is very appealing. But another big issue is that many countries, lotteries like this were illegal. In Ireland, they were legal, so they ran them, and they sold tickets in the countries where it was illegal. And so much of their money came from the US and Canada and Britain. So it ends up being something of a scam. Some people have called it the greatest bleeding heart racket in the world.
That's a great quote.
Well, sure, but you can see that what they're doing is tying it to a good cause. And people think, I could win money and I'm supporting a good cause. But the numbers show that maybe 10% or a little less than that of the overall money went to the hospitals themselves. So a lot more could have gone. Instead, a whole bunch went to the organizers. Those three guys became multimillionaires. And, you know, the government of Ireland officially allowed it. Later on, they start to investigate it, seeing that maybe it's not as above board as it should be.
Right.
But the scheme, it employed 4,000 people in Ireland. So whenever politicians might say, well, we might have to shut you down, these organizers would say, really? Do you want to put 4,000 people out of work? And it wasn't completely a scam. Some of the money did go to the hospitals and helped even eventually to push tuberculosis almost out of Ireland, because they had a huge trouble with that. I guess the issue here is that after the war, Ireland was still struggling so heavily, and they were trying to find ways to survive, both politically and health of the people of the country. So let's look a little bit more closely at these. I haven't used my close-up camera yet, so I want to show a little bit of the ticket itself. It shows that this is tied to the Cambridgeshire run at Newmarket, England. So that's the race that this particular ticket is tied to, and that it's done by subscription. 10 shillings is the cost of this ticket. There are a lot of other very interesting things about it, though. Like in this, it says make sure that your tickets have the watermark, and that watermark would say Swiftbrook Limited, Irish made, $1,000 reward, conviction imitators. They ended up getting a lot of counterfeit tickets out there because if you're selling them in a country where the lottery is illegal anyway, well, it's easy enough to fake it because if the ticket never wins, you're probably not going to check that.
Do we know if they caught any imitators?
Yeah, some of the counterfeiters were caught, but they usually weren't prosecuted terribly heavily, I'm afraid. When they would find people with tickets, now whether or not they were counterfeit, they would usually confiscate them and burn them. So there were a bit more of the imagery that I wanted to talk about. First of all, it did say $1,000, right? And that's because so many of these were sold in the US and Canada. Even though you would win in pounds, the 30,000 pounds, some of the bigger races you could win much more than that, up to 150,000 pounds, I believe. But some of this imagery is great. This sort of tiara'd woman is really an interesting sort of stoic figure. And I guess that's trying to show just how important this was and how it would benefit things like the hospitals. But, you know, imagery like this is very important. And I know we've seen that these things carry a lot of messages. Part of the how this thing was made is that it has that watermark that they mention. And you can see with this, very dark, but the lighter wording is part of the watermark. It's in the paper itself. So looking to images like this are important, and that $1,000 reward, because US and Canada both use dollars as currency. And in fact, many Americans went to fight with the British in the First World War, even before the United States entered the war.
Yes.
Back to the First World War, right, in this medal.
Yes, and we have some great imagery on this medal we should examine.
What do we got here?
Well, first of all, we have several different ways in which people fought in World War I. So, of course, you have infantry soldiers with their crossed rifles. Mm-hmm. We have a plane in the sky. World War I was the first war to use large amounts of aviation, and a battleship in the background. The only thing it really doesn't have is a tank.
Oh, that's true. And they did start using tanks there, didn't they?
And, of course, we have a royal crown, and we have a laurel wreath around the edges.
No real imagery on the back, but it does mention the Kingdom of Mourne, and it also gives us a silver hallmark at the bottom, right?
Right, which is Vaughan and Sons. It was a goldsmiths, silversmiths, and medalists in Birmingham, England.
Exactly, and there is an anchor symbol. It's hard to see. That's Birmingham. There's a lion. That's sterling silver. And then there's the letter V, which is the year 1920. That's when it was struck.
And, of course, we have a fragment of a name. We have J. Wilson.
We do indeed, and that is important because this gets to the who, right?
Right.
But very quickly, I think I want to also talk a little bit about that where. We're back here to the map of Ireland, and I want to show a little bit more about Mourne itself. There's Northern Ireland, and that red zone, which we'll zoom in on, is the Kingdom of Mourne. You can see how small it is compared to the overall county down. So let's hear a little bit more about Wilson if we know. Here's the who on our medal.
Well, this is where we have to remind ourselves that as historians, we're at the mercy of very imperfect and incomplete records. There's a record of one Wilson, one J. Wilson in Kilkeel itself. However, there's a problem as his serial number is shared with another J. Wilson who died in World War I combat in Africa. And that's actually a very interesting side story. There were colonial wars in Africa going on in World War I at the time, because you had the French, the British, the Germans, all of these people fighting each other.
Right.
Or the two sides fighting each other over colonial ambitions.
Exactly, because the Germans had some colonial possessions in Africa, and so they were part of the war. This J. Wilson that we think is probably an error, really, because I think there's a guy, Jay White, who has that number, right? And he's the one, I believe, who died in Africa.
Yes, absolutely.
But that's,
Absolutely.
like you say, part of the records. There can be errors in records.
Right, and there's just not much we can do about that.
So we know a bit about how that this medal was made, struck out of silver in 1920. But the Countess herself died that year, I believe.
Right, and so it was the next year they started to actually award these.
Right, 1921, they were given out, and 36 of them posthumously, and the rest to people who had survived the war. Well, the Wilson question, it's one that I find a little frustrating, because this is one of the few times that one of our artifacts has a name on it. And you would think, therefore, we should know exactly who it is. There are a few other J. Wilsons that I've found close by in the Rath-Freeland area, but that's just north of the mountains of Mourne. Usually these records list where they were born, though. Anyone could have been born in a place and moved to another and lived there most of the time, and been considered part of Kilkeel, perhaps, if any of these people had moved there. But there's another John Wilson who was in the Royal Navy, and his records show that in 1915 he was mustered out, and the word they use is invalided, so he became ill, and it says after that, tuberculosis. Now, I bring that up because tuberculosis was a big problem in Ireland, and part of this money that was raised from the sweepstakes that we have an artifact from went to try to fight tuberculosis. And eventually it did help them to all but eradicate it, but that didn't happen until about the 1970s. They were still struggling with it. There was a vaccine that was created in the 20s, trialed, and then issued in the 30s, but it didn't really get to Ireland until the 40s, when their health minister started to push for this. So there's a long history of the Irish sweepstakes, and the one we have in 1936, it is very interesting. But by 1937...
We have a new constitution.
Right, but it's not quite... I think they declare themselves no longer a free state, but they aren't yet a republic, is that right?
Right. The republic officially came into existence in the late 1940s.
Right. So all of this complicated history is still going on, and
Yeah.
these are just examples of things that have echoes even to the modern day. The sweepstakes lasted until 1987, but it was no longer as popular out in the countries where they were selling so much in US and Canada, even in the 1960s. The reason there, many of these countries started to legalize their own sweepstakes lotteries. So you're no longer going to buy one from overseas and worry about whether or not this ticket's really going to get back to a barrel in Ireland to be drawn. I guess if you're not spending a lot of money and you've got the chance of winning a whole lot, why do people buy lottery tickets today? I could win a lot, and I'm only risking a little. There are chances of winning one in, 3 billion or something, and yet, okay.
Well, somebody's got to win, though.
Right. So it's the same mentality. We all feel it, It's nice to win, and even if your ticket was drawn for a horse, you did win something. It could be 100 pounds, and that might be, a pretty decent reward. I think in the later years, it was up to 500 pounds just for having been drawn. However, if you've got 3 million tickets and they're only drawing a few for the horses that run in the race, your chances are still pretty small. Eventually, there was an Irish National Lottery that came about in 1987, and the sweepstakes ended. But by that point, these three organizers were multimillionaires many times over, I think. And many people do talk about it as if it's corruption. In some ways it was. A lot of the money, some went to the hospitals, but some of it went to the IRA to arm them, and they were still using guerrilla tactics against the English and against Northern Ireland, and right up through the time known as the Troubles, I think, and to the Good Friday Agreement, something like that.
And that was as recent as 1998.
And even today, we still see some reflections of this. There has to be a border between the EU and Great Britain because Britain has decided to leave the EU. And the only land border will be there in Ireland. There's
a huge debate about whether or not it'll be a hard border. How will this impact customs? Will there be guard towers posted again?
Exactly. So these artifacts that we've looked at have helped us to be grounded a bit in this complex history, to understand it a little more. I still don't think I know it all. I certainly don't.
No, neither do I.
But I'm amazed by what I can find out just by looking into these things. I like having that focal point and trying to understand history from the perspective of an object that was made and used in that complicated time.
Yeah, it's incredibly engaging as a process.
It is, and I think that's about all the time we have for now. So thanks for joining us on this episode. I'm Brad Hafford.
And I'm Tom Pedrick.
Join us again on the next Artifactually Speaking.
We'll see you then.